What's up everyone, it's Dakota and welcome back to another modern video, and today we're going to be revisiting a deck that ended up being probably one of my most popular deck techs on the channel, and there's been some pretty decent innovations and some new tech this deck has gotten really since that video, and of course with the modern metagame evolving with Lord of the Rings and all that, and you know, months and months of just getting to kind of adjust the format and tune to some of the best decks. We're going to go ahead and take a look back at the Mono Green Hardened Scales deck. For Modern, this list in particular is piloted by Paiganti, who took it to a top 16 finish in the Modern Challenge. And Paiganti is also a very notable Moto grinder, so I opted for this list over the list that actually made it to the quarterfinals of the event. So, of course, before we get in too deep for this Hardened Scales deck, I would appreciate it if you're not already subscribed to the channel that you do so and ring the notification bell as well. That way you know when videos like this and others get posted, as well as joining the Discord server. There's a link down in the description where you can follow that and join. So, Modern Hardened Scales is based around this card, Hardened Scales. Pretty simple. Essentially, when one or more +1/+1 counters are put on a creature you control, you put that many +1. So if you put one counter on it, if you have Hardened Scales out, it puts on 2. If you would put 2 counters on it, it puts on 3, and so on. So if you have multiples of these, you add up multiple counters. So if you have 2 Hardened Scales in play and you put 1 counter on something, you end up adding 1 up to 2 and then 2 up to 3. Pretty simple in that case. You also have Ozolith, the Shattered Spire, which also says that if you put a +1/+1 counter on an artifact or a creature you control, you put that many +1 instead. And then you have the ability to pay 2, tap it, put a +1/+1 counter on a target creature or artifact you control, and you can only activate it as a sorcery, and you can cycle it too. Sure, why not? So this is actually interesting when you pair it with the Ozolith from the original Ikoria set. Whenever a creature leaves the battlefield and had counters on it, you put the counters on the Ozolith, and then at the beginning of combat in your turn, you can transfer the Ozolith counters onto the creature. This ends up making this deck super complicated and has a lot of lines of play where you would think that you cannot kill somebody from it, and then, you know, if they don't math it out, but you math it out, they're probably dead. So the Ozolith has this interesting synergy where you can essentially put counters on the Ozolith, and you're going to get to put like 2 counters on it because of the Ozolith's like own ability. Hardened Scales will not benefit from putting counters on the Ozolith, but essentially, like, this gives you a 5th copy of Hardened Scales with the added bonus of getting to put counters on any of your other artifacts and or creatures. You can put on like any artifacts. You can put on like a welding jar. And if you have an Ozolith in play, you can sacrifice the welding jar and then put the counters on the Ozolith, which is actually a sneaky way that you can actually get more counters, considering that the Ozolith would put a counter on welding jar and the Ozolith itself would put it up to 2. Sacrifice the welding jar into something. You have an Ozolith in play. It takes the counters off. It puts the 2 counters on there. It's getting +1/+1 counters, so the Ozolith goes up to 3. That's just like one of the ways that this deck can get complicated, and that's just from the namesake cards, you know, the kind of the little engine that makes it go. So what are we doing with these? So one of the ways, and probably one of the easiest ways that you can win the game, is with Inkmoth Nexus. Turning into a 1/1 artifact creature, it has flying and infect, so you only need 9 +1/+1 counters on it. If you have something like a Hardened Scales or an Ozolith, and you're able just to kind of like get some of these other creatures going, and then you put the counters on the Inkmoth Nexus, you can just kind of win the game out of nowhere that way. You have Hangerback Walker and you have Walking Ballista. Walking Ballista, you just shove a ton of counters on it, and you end up just shooting your opponent for a ton of damage. Hangerback Walker can end up making just a ton of 1/1 flyers that your opponent has a hard time dealing with, and you can do it at instant speed thanks to cards like Arcbound Ravager, which is also going to be an important card we'll get to here in a second, that you can just make a ton of Thopters and then win the game that way. As we mentioned, Arcbound Ravager is kind of like where this deck can get super crazy in conjunction with an Ozolith and a Hardened Scales. Every time you sacrifice an artifact, you put a +1/+1 counter on the Arcbound Ravager, and you're actually able to sacrifice the Ravager to its own ability. And thanks to something called Modular, and I'll explain this as as one because it's weird. So, say we have an Arcbound Ravager with 4+1/+1 counters on it. We just have this and an Ozolith in play. We sacrifice the Arcbound Ravager. The modular counters get to go on an artifact creature, so we'll modular onto a Patchwork Automaton. So it gets 4 counters from the Arcbound Ravager. But because the Arcbound Ravager left the battlefield and it had 4 counters on it, the Ozolith also gets 4 counters, meaning that at the beginning of combat in your turn, you can put another 4 counters on Patchwork Automaton or what have you. Of course, going back to our previous example of like Inkmoth Nexus, having an Arcbound Ravager with 5+1/+1 counters on it and an Ozolith in play means that you could also put essentially 10 counters, even more, because usually getting up to like 5 counters on an Arcbound Ravager is a lot easier when you have a Hardened Scales in play. So to kind of map that out, if you have an Arcbound Ravager with at least 2 other artifacts that also don't have modular, like if you just sacrifice a Hangerback Walker and like a token to put counters on Ravager to get it up to 5, assuming that we have like just a Hardened Scales in play. We can then activate the Inkmoth, sacrifice the Ravager, put the 5 counters on the Inkmoth, puts up to 6 power. 5 counters go on the Ozolith, and then those 5 counters get moved onto the Inkmoth, which is 11, ends up being 12, 13 because we forgot to add the other one that it adds when a creature gets a counter, and then of course it's getting counters again, so it gets another one. So that is a lot of power. And that even makes it possible for like a Patchwork Automaton to also deal lethal for the fact that like while you're casting these artifact spells, you're getting +1/+1 counters on it, which means that really on like turn 1 turn 1 Hardened Scales, turn 2 Patchwork Automaton, you play like an Ozolith the Shattered Spire, and then you follow it up with like a Welding Jar, like a Shadow Spear, you're getting a ton of counters putting on a Patchwork Automaton to the point where it is going to be super lethal really quick. And if you pair it with the Shadow Spear, which of course you can get with the Urza Sagas, you just have this huge lifelinking threat that is going to deal tons of damage super early and often and be very hard to deal with. Having Ward 2 as well, making it even harder considering that there's really no free removal spells that people are playing in the format currently, aside from something like Solitude or Fury. But Patchwork Automaton has the added benefit of being able to get out of Fury range relatively quickly, thanks to all the cheap artifacts and stuff in the deck. We mentioned that there were some new cards in the deck. Zabaz is nothing new. Arcbound Ravager, Patchwork, all these creatures and stuff aren't really like new. Scrapyard Recombiner is not a new card in the sense that it wasn't printed in like Lord of the Rings or in the Wilds of Eldraine set, but it was printed in the OG Modern Horizons, and it does have modular itself, which is nice. And then you can also tap it and sacrifice an artifact to Schleber for a construct. Be able to put it to your hand, which means that you can get a card like Patchwork Automaton, Walking Ballista, or Hangback Walker. And as we kind of outlined, like these creatures, I don't think as important as the Arcbound Ravager. Arcbound Ravager is a beast, by the way. That I don't know if they actually got eroded to construct. Let's take a look real quick. We'll do it live. So I couldn't find out if Arcbound Ravager was a beast or not, or was a construct or not. I'm gonna say no, which is weird because Arcbound Ravager probably should be a construct. Anyway, Scrapyard Recombiner finds your either your big threat that just is going to get big from you just casting your spells, Walking Ballista as like a win condition purely on its own, Arcbound Ravager getting the like combo potential to make a ton of Thopters that could just win the game, or even make more artifacts, so then you can make an even bigger Arcbound Ravager, which means you can put even more counters on any one of these other threats that you have in play. Ancient Stirrings kind of brings it all together. Also a new card from the new set, Wilds of Eldraine, and Agatha's Soul's Cauldron, pulls a double duty in the way that you can exile some of your own things, where you can just put a ton of counters on one single creature, and like exile a Walking Ballista, and you can just exile, or you can remove counters and shoot your opponent. You can exile an Arcbound Ravager and turn that creature essentially into an Arcbound Ravager, on top of making a Walking Ballista, on top of having one or two Hardened Scales or an Ozolith in play, and so on, that you could just fireball your opponent super easily in that sense. It even like the one of like Scrapyard Recombiner, you could technically do that as well. Uh, And even on top of all of that, even further, you have exiling your opponent's creatures. That could be relevant, and just kind of using it as graveyard hate before also using it as like combo potential for any of your other creatures. The mana base, you have two gemstone caverns, which is probably the interesting one, which means that if you're not the starting player, you can exile a card from your hand and put gemstone caverns into play with a luck counter, and it'll tap for colors, but if it has a luck counter on it, you can add one mana of any color. uh, Interesting. I think this is just a way that you can kind of like get ahead of your opponent who is going first. We've seen this in like rhinos and that, and it ends up working out pretty well, and I can imagine in a deck like this it's probably pretty good as well. You have four Grove of the Burn Willows. Taps for a colorless, adds a green or a red. The red being a little bit important for the Zabaz that you have, where you can destroy an artifact you control, and that's kind of like a way that you can get some of like the arc, or not really the Arcbound Ravager or modular triggers, but like blowing up like your own Walker when you don't have an Arcbound Ravager, and so on. You have four Inkmoth Nexus. We pointed out very important to the deck as like a way that you can couple together some really easy kills without having a ton of like artifacts or like just resources in general in play. Pendlehaven, giving a +1/+2 to your 1/1 creatures, like just so easy way you can activate Ink Moth, get in for 2 points, cut the clock in half. On top of getting to like keep a walking ballista around after you remove a counter, only if it has a single counter on it. As like a way if you want to be able to do it and then add more counters to it and so on. Just some of the little things that like you can do with a card like this. It's just really neat to have. It taps for a green. It's the most important color in your deck. That's all you really need. You have four snow-covered forests. You have a stomping ground. Again, having a red mana to activate Zabaz. You have four Urza sagas. You have plenty of ones that you want to get along with the welding jar and some of these other one-ups and stuff. So just very good to have. These constructs get super huge. Obviously, Shadow Spear and constructs end up making a really good combination. And you have a Yavimaya as a way to kind of make all of your lands tap for green mana in a pinch if you so need them. And yeah, that is the Hardened Scales deck for Modern. It is a super complicated deck. It's a deck that I learned a lot about like when playing it, and literally like the turns where you think you're going to lose the game, you have to sit there and math it out like 20 times to make sure that you have enough damage, because a lot of the times if you just have enough resources in play and your opponent's not able to interact in a meaningful way, you can just win the game out of nowhere. And it's a deck that is a lot more rewarding, and probably one of the most rewarding decks to play if you dive into it, you play it as much as you possibly can. So I think this might be a deck that we play on stream or something to that effect. Something that we definitely play this week, because I just enjoy playing a deck like this, like doing all the math and stuff. Because even if you think you do it right and you end up doing enough, you could end up doing a lot more. So if that kind of sums up like what this deck can do. So of course, if you like the video, please have a like, comment down below what deck you want to see next, join the Discord server, links in the description below, and of course subscribe and ring the notification bell if you want to see more videos like this, other Pioneer content, and other essay type videos as well. That's gonna do it for me. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you all in the next one.